I'm afraid I'm not going to be answering the question that you hoped that I would. I thought I would actually just give an overview of what has driven me with chemistry all these years. And so I'm actually going to start right at the very start, and that is the day I was born, which was on the day before the fighting with Germany ended in the Second World War. And the people, apparently, as my mother drove in a taxi to the hospital, people were dancing in the streets because there'd already been a ceasefire. But my father wasn't there to enjoy that because he was on his way on a ship up to New Guinea. He had actually served in the army from the very start of the war. He was a rat of Tobruk, and he mostly served in a hospital unit for the duration of the war. So, like many children of returned soldiers, I went to a government school that by all of today's standards would have been classified as very disadvantaged. It only opened in 1956 in local school halls. It's one of many high schools built at the time. And when I started in 1957, it was just a couple of buildings on a swamp. We had lessons in shelter sheds, we had lessons in corridors, we had no library, we had no science rooms, we had no resources at all. All we had was blackboard and chalk and a couple of excellent teachers, some good teachers, and as always the case, some very poor teachers. In the 6 years I was there, we had 4 different headmasters, in fact. At the end of year 10, we had to choose what course we would do for year 11 and year 12. And all you had a choice between doing was science, arts, or commerce. My history teacher, and a couple of you have heard this story before, but my history teacher, for whom I was actually his sort of top pupil and I loved history, came up to me and said, well, what are you going to do next year, Jenny? And I said, well, I was thinking of doing science. Girls don't do science, he said. Well, of course I had to do it then, didn't I, to prove him wrong and to show girls could do it too. I was the first girl in the school to choose science. Another girl in my year, who was my close friend, in fact, said, oh, well, if you're going to do it, I will do it. But the reality was, by the time we were in year 12, there were just us 2 girls and 20 boys in our chemistry class. Overall, there were only, of the 200 people who started at year 7, by year 12, there were only 10 girls left and 27 boys. That was all. The rest had all gone. Now, there were some very good reasons for that. For a start, a lot of people were really struggling financially, you know, including my family, because of the results of the war. And so, because the school leaving age then was 14 in Australia, a lot of people left at the age of 14 to help support their family. This particularly affected girls. And I remember seeing a lot of girls sobbing their hearts out because they had to leave school the day they turned 14. Another reason for that in particular was that there was a prevailing attitude that girls didn't really need an education because they were just going to get married and have children. And even if it was acknowledged that girls could have an education, then they thought they should all be nurses and teachers. Now, the fact is that the girls who studied with me and who did arts and commerce and so on, I mean, most of them did end up as being teachers. A lot of them, however, left at the end of year 11 because those days you could get into both nursing and primary teaching with just year 11. So there weren't very many of us, and it took a great deal of determination to keep going. And in my case, I had to work really, really hard, and that's where I learned my good working habits, if you could say that, because the only way I could persuade my parents to keep me at school was to keep winning scholarships and keep doing so well that they didn't feel they could take me away. They themselves had gone to school just to the end of year 10 because their education was disrupted by the Great Depression, so they allowed me to stay, but I had to win all those scholarships and so on at a government school to keep going. So that taught me a great deal. And I also had to deal, of course, with a lot of teasing from the boys, as you can imagine. But interestingly, since then, I've organised a whole lot of reunions of my year level. We've managed to find a great number of them and our past teachers. In the last few years, I've organised several reunions and even written books about stories of what they've done with their lives. And we call them our bio books. And you would be stunned if you knew the kind of career paths those people had in spite of our very tough beginning. The things those people have done with their lives are just extraordinary. They've shown enormous initiative and drive. They've done all sorts of exciting things you would never expect. And even some of the people who left early have gone back and studied and done PhDs and so on. So even though they were forced to leave young, they have gone back. And so I just think that's just the most remarkable thing. And those boys who tease me, of course, are great mates now. We see each other at these reunions. We have a lovely time. So there you go. So now, fast forward to university. At university, I really, really desperately wanted to be a teacher by then. For me, education had opened up an entire new world to me. It was just an exciting world. I just loved learning. And so I wanted to impart that to other people. And in fact, I also was often asked by my classmates to help them when they couldn't solve problems. So I did a lot of teaching when I was at school even. And so I desperately wanted to be a teacher. Even though I got the marks that would have let me into medicine, I chose to do teaching. And I've never regretted that. I won a Commonwealth Scholarship, but I ended up taking a studentship because it paid a little more of an allowance, because I knew I would have to be financially independent the moment I left school, which I was. I even had to pay board to help with the family finances. And I had to live at home. I lived at Blackrock, which was, quite some distance away from Melbourne Uni. And it was just the most extraordinary vertical curve I found myself on doing the chemistry at the university, because our matric year, we just learned equivalent weights and lots of solubilities and equation writing and things like that. Never heard of a mole or anything like that. So it was really virtually a complete vertical learning curve studying chemistry at the university. I did the honours course for 3 years. That was a very, very full-on course. Then we had to have studied second year pure maths to cope with the maths in third year. And we had lots of experimental work and so on, but I loved all of it. However, there was another side to it, and that was there was enormous snobbery, prejudice, and bullying that went on amongst the students, particularly in first year. And in my case, and there were very few girls in the class. In my case, I had a prac partner for chemistry in first year who came from a very well-known school that now is actually co-ed, but then was an all-boys school. And he looked me up and down and he said, I got to work with a girl. And then he said, and what school did you go to? And when I said it was a high school, he couldn't believe what bad luck he had, you know, and he taunted me all year. It was very, very difficult. But I was determined that I was going to rise above all of that and just do my very best. And interestingly, those few of us who were from government schools, because most of the school students were from private schools, but those of us who were from high schools, we had already learnt to be responsible for our own learning, really. We'd had to be in the situations we were in, whereas those students had pretty well been spoon-fed. And a lot of them failed, including my prac partner. Not that I didn't take great delight in it or anything, but I thought it was an interesting development, shall we say. Anyway, interestingly, having dealt with that sort of that kind of social isolation that I was put in particularly first year by such people, that started me, plus some of my experiences at school, on complete dedication to social justice. And in particular, the issues that concern me were the great divide between the haves and the have-nots. And the other big issue, of course, is sexism. And so I have devoted a lot of time to those things. And interestingly, 30 years later, as it were, in 1996, I initiated and convened a big conference on poverty at the University of Melbourne. It was residential. We had about 120 students from across Australia, from all three school systems. And it wasn't just a talk fest, but I can tell you it was the most life-changing experience. A documentary was made of that by the ABC TV and has shown on it several times. So one of the reasons I actually got my OAM was not for my chemistry teaching only, but for my work in leadership and social justice with students, of which I've spent years and years of voluntary work in my own time and with a lot of love doing, working with young people to help them develop all the leadership skills to deal with those things. So it's ironic that after all of that, I actually am very grateful. I'm also very grateful for the excellence and the challenge of the courses I had at the university. I don't think they have as much practical work now, and I know that it's not as challenging because they don't have to have second year pure maths to cope with the maths in third year chemistry anymore. So that set me on a path of dedication to excellence in chemistry. So unfortunately, at the end of third year, Dr. Joan Radford asked if I would be interested in doing a Master of Chemistry Education to do a project on reducing the divide between what was then in matriculation and what was happening at university, because the jump was just so enormous. But she wrote to the education department to get them to release me to do that, but they refused because I was female. But I mean, I could understand to a degree though, because the schools were so short of teachers. They were bringing in American teachers and all the rest. There was such a terrible shortage of teachers. So I went on and did my DPed, and that was the start of my baptism of fire into teaching, because just before my second teaching round, the teacher that was supposed to supervise me died. So when I went on my teaching round, I had to take all his classes as though I was a fully fledged teacher. So that was really a great experience, one that stood me in good stead, and I really enjoyed it, to be honest. But then the fire really started, because the next year I was first appointed to Chadstone High. It had only been going for 5 years, and so I only went up to year 11. I was given 2 year 11 chemistry classes, both of which had about 30 students in them, as well as, you know, other classes in year 10, and including maths, because I'd done so much maths, you know. So anyway, I was the only person on the entire staff with a science degree. The only one. The others had done a couple of years training at the Secondary Teachers College. That was it. So imagine the shock of the school when I was given a day's notice to move to Noble Park High at the beginning of July. And the reason that happened was because the teacher who was there, he taught 3 matriculation subjects: chemistry, pure maths and applied maths, and then year 11 chemistry. And he wasn't happy about how much promotion he was not getting. So he just walked out of the school and left them in this terrible situation. And so I was asked to take up what he did, except the physics teacher took the applied maths class, and instead I got a year 10 science class. But I still had to suddenly prepare matriculation chemistry, matriculation pure maths, as well as year 11 chemistry and year 10 science. When I drove to the school, and the headmaster just about fell on his knees in gratitude somebody was there, but he said, "Now, can you please write our exams? We've got exams next week," and he didn't write any exam papers. So I had to I said, "Well, can you get me some books from the students?" And I had some all-nighters writing the exams for them. And I discovered to my horror that at that stage, I mean, it was quite a rigorous chemistry course. I don't know whether any of you remember the strengths textbook, but it was quite a rigorous course by then. And you also had to have done 22 experiments for matriculation chemistry. And the book, the practical book, had to be handed into the examining body. And if you hadn't done them, you didn't pass the subject. This was July, and he'd only done 3. There was no lab tech at the school. So I had to work really, really hard to get those students through. It was a very challenging, difficult year. I meant to say that when I was at Chadstone High, I did have a lab tech, but he was a young fellow who left school at the end of year 11 to do primary teacher training, didn't like it, so got a job at the school as a lab tech. He had no chemistry knowledge whatsoever. So of course I had to do his job there too, as well as mine. However, because he was male, he got paid more than me. That's the way it was those days. Anyway, at the end of that year, unfortunately, I had to change schools again because I was married, and we built a house over in the eastern suburbs. So I very reluctantly left, and I went to Blackburn High. And then, like Ruth said before, I unexpectedly became pregnant, and I had to leave. At that stage, you had to leave when you were 5 months pregnant, because they didn't like the idea of pregnant women being in front of students. Now, I I had, you know, a matriculation chemistry class, a large one, over 30 boys mostly, a couple of girls, and um, and the education department replaced me with a fellow who was Egyptian, who could barely speak English and had only done agricultural chemistry. So I just couldn't in all conscience abandon my students. So I begged the headmaster to let me continue teaching at least the year 12 class until the end of the year. It meant to keep it secret from the education department. I received no pay, of course, but I did that till the end of the year. Then followed that was a few years at home, not only with the daughter that was born to me then, but then I had a son. Unfortunately, during that whole pregnancy with my son, I became totally deaf. I could not hear a sound of any kind. And it was a very, very difficult experience, I have to tell you. I'd already had, I might add, problems with my ears since I was a child. I'd already had a massive operation on my bad ear in the school holidays just before matric. But here I was in really dire straits. I was really worried. I had 2 very big operations and I only ever got the hearing back on in one ear. And I was really frightened. While I was deaf, of course, I was really, really frightened for the welfare of my children, because if they were in trouble, I wouldn't hear. But then I was really scared I wouldn't be allowed to be a teacher again. So I went and got advice and was told to apply straight away, but not to let them know I had a hearing problem. And as long as I didn't apply to be permanent, they couldn't test me for my hearing. They said, if you can teach for 3 years and prove you can do it, then you they can't have any argument and force you out, because really somebody who's totally deaf in one ear was not allowed to be a teacher, you see. So I taught for those 3 years at the school, and this now was Canterbury Girls High, and I learned every trick in the trade to cope, because even though I cannot tell where sounds come from, I had sharp eyes, luckily, so I coped, you know. And that, not long after that, is when I met Yvonne, who was in my year 9 science class. And so they were actually really great years in terms of chemistry teaching, because then we had some excellent books, really good books. And I don't know whether any of you, I don't want to sort of overdo this, but we had, I don't know whether you can see these, but we had Matter Under Investigation, and we had Chemistry Key to the Earth, which was such rich resources. They were just wonderful. I really loved teaching that. We had options. The students had to, we had internal assessment where the students had to spend 3 weeks on each of 3 options. And it was just wonderful, because I was able to take my students out to all sorts of places, you know, chemical plants, research labs, you name it, I took them. And also that included Albright and Wilson, because I chose the surface chemistry option. And I'm sure I met you there, Richard. I'm sure I might have even communicated with you about that. I also took them to a viscosity and lab. No, not viscosity lab, a colloid lab, and so on. So altogether, I really loved chemistry. I thought they were the best years of teaching chemistry. The course was rigorous. The students saw how relevant it was through all our excursions. We did enormous amounts of practical work. It was just lovely. Then 1990 came, and it was the start of the VCE. Now, the whole reason behind it changed then, because they were concerned about the poor retention rates. They wanted to make everybody do year 12 if possible. They also wanted chemistry to be open to people who may not want to use it directly. So, so what happened then was I thought the course was a lot watered down, and the early resource books were very superficial, very thin and very superficial. They changed from the options, and that's the worst thing, to the students answering a question. What happened with that? It didn't require any practical work. So what happened then was a lot of teachers hardly were doing any practical work, which worried me considerably. And quite a few schools were cheating, because you could buy essays and things, you know, online, and teachers could, anyway, it was just awful. In the end, I'd already written a maths textbook at the end of 1989 for Year 10 maths, or at least co-wrote it. But I then started to write chemistry books, and that's one of the chemistry books I wrote. Richard asked me to show them to you. That was with Nelson Thompson. You can see it's quite a tome, a very detailed book, and did one for Year 11 and one for Year 12. I had a bit of disruption during the Year 12 one, because my ear tumours came back and I had to have a major surgery again in the middle of trying to write that and teach at the same time. But anyway, I then, by that stage, when I was doing VCE, I was actually not at Canterbury Girls anymore, I might add. I taught at a couple of private schools. And then in 2000, we went to a third school, but I was finding my loss of hearing was just becoming much more difficult to work with. I was getting exhausted with the concentration it demanded. And so in the end, when I was offered a position at an educational publisher that had published those two Nelson chemistry books earlier, I jumped at the chance. Nevertheless, I continued coaching, and because I felt I needed to keep in very au fait with the problems students had. Because in my books, I was determined to make it as accessible language as possible, as interesting as possible. I spent a lot of time going around Australia, in fact, doing research work, talking to lots of experts to make the books more interesting. And since then, I first of all wrote some science textbooks like that, Science Edge. There was a series of 4, and I also wrote a second edition of the chemistry books, as well as many, many other resources. At the same time, I did a huge amount of work that you alluded to for the VCA. And to this day, I'm just as passionate about chemistry as I was when I started all those years ago. I still love it. I'm still passionate about teaching, which is why I do all the teaching workshops. And I think I've had, I've had challenges, certainly, but I have been so lucky to do all that. I feel very privileged. But I hope from all of this, you all might realise that, in my view, I think secondary teaching is a really important career. I get a bit annoyed when people say, oh, those who can do, those who can't teach. I think that's really not fair, and I hope I've proved that. So thank you very much.